Joseph Carter, a Vietnam War veteran, stood in front of Wilson's diner, a place that had always been his refuge in a world that often treated him like a stranger. The southern sun beat down on his weathered face, highlighting the wrinkles that told stories of sacrifice, pain, and service to his country. As he climbed out of his truck, his knees creaked under the weight of decades, reminding him that he was no longer the young and strong man he once was. Each step toward the door was a struggle against the pain of old wounds. As he entered, the familiar jingle of the doorbell echoed through the air, but something felt off. The usual friendly faces turned cold as they glanced his way. He had been here hundreds of times before, but today the atmosphere was filled with uncomfortable tension. Joseph made his way to his usual spot at the counter and nodded at the waitress behind it. Sarah greeted him with a nervous smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But it was when Wilson, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen that the real unease hit Joseph. Wilson, the man who had always treated him with respect and courtesy, now looked at him like an intruder. "What can I do for you today, Joseph?" Wilson's voice was gruff, lacking its usual warmth. Joseph tried to ignore the change in tone, assuming Wilson was just having a bad day. "The usual, Wilson. A coffee and a slice of your famous apple pie," Joseph replied with a friendly smile. But instead of the cordial response he expected, Wilson clenched his jaw, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the counter. "We're out of apple pie today," he said sharply. Joseph blinked in confusion, glancing over at the glass display where a freshly baked pie sat in plain view. "But Wilson, it's right there. I said we're out," Wilson repeated, his voice rising, causing everyone in the diner to stop and stare. The air grew thick with tension. Joseph felt the humiliation hit him like a freight train. After years of serving his country and being a loyal customer, he was now being treated as an outsider, as unwelcome. His heart pounded with a familiar hurt, one he thought had healed long ago. "Did I do something to offend you, Wilson?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling with disbelief. Wilson's face twisted into a sneer. "You've done enough just by walking in here," he spat. "I don't serve your kind in my establishment. Now get out before I call the authorities." Joseph staggered back, stunned by the emotional blow he had just received. For years, he had been a loyal customer, and he had never imagined that Wilson, of all people, would treat him this way. He felt the stares of everyone in the diner, some filled with shock, others with cold indifference, as he struggled to keep tears from falling. With his head lowered, he made his way to the door, his heart heavy with betrayal. As he left, a young woman sitting nearby stood up, her voice trembling with indignation. "This isn't right," she said, her voice shaking. "You can't treat him like this." Wilson turned on her, his eyes burning with fury. "This is my diner, and I'll run it how I see fit. If you don't like it, you can leave too." The young woman hesitated, her courage faltering under the weight of Wilson's glare. She sat back down, ashamed, as Joseph disappeared out the door. As Joseph drove home, Wilson's words echoed in his mind. "I don't serve your kind." Those words took him back to a time when he was young, fresh out of the army, facing a nation that treated him as a second-class citizen despite risking his life for it. When he arrived at his small, modest home, Joseph collapsed into his worn armchair, unable to shake the humiliation he had just endured. Anger began to bubble up inside him. After everything he had done, after all the sacrifices, was this really what he deserved? He looked at the photos of his late wife on the mantle, remembering how she had always comforted him during times like these. Margaret had been his calm in the storm, the voice that reminded him he was a good man, worth far more than the hatred that surrounded him. Just as tears began to form in his eyes, his phone rang. Seeing the name on the screen, his heart skipped a beat. It was Marcus, his son, a man who had achieved more than Joseph had ever dreamed of. A senator, fighting for justice and equality for all. "Dad," Marcus's voice was firm but laced with concern. "I just heard what happened at the diner. Are you okay?" Joseph sighed. "I've been better, son, but it's nothing I haven't faced before. It just caught me off guard that it was Wilson. I didn't expect this from him." Marcus was silent for a moment before responding. "Dad, we can't let this go. This isn't just about personal prejudice. It's a symptom of something much bigger. And I'm not going to let him get away with it. This isn't over. Joseph sat in his armchair long after the call with Marcus had ended, the quiet of his home now feeling suffocating. His eyes wandered to the small, tattered flag on the mantel, a symbol of his service and sacrifice. He had fought for a country that seemed to keep fighting against him. And now, the humiliation at the diner had rekindled a fire within him, one that he thought had been extinguished long ago. As he sat there, his mind began to turn, not with anger, but with resolve. He had faced prejudice before, and each time he had walked away. This time he felt something was different. This was his town. He had roots here. He had friends, neighbors, people who respected him, or at least he thought they had. The sting of betrayal was deeper than it had ever been. But so was his determination not to let this pass in silence. Joseph rose from his chair, walked to the kitchen, and sat down at the table with an old notebook. He flipped through the pages, glancing at the names and numbers of people he had known for years. Veterans, community leaders, friends, all of whom had stood by him in one way or another. As the names scrolled past his fingers, he found himself thinking about how many of them had been silent in that diner. Why hadn't they said anything? Had they always thought this way? Or were they simply too scared to speak up? That night, Joseph drafted a letter, one that would set the tone for what was to come. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't willing to accept what had happened either. Tomorrow, the letter would be sent to every local official, every community group, and every veterans organization in the county. It was time to rally the people who had long ignored the quiet bigotry that had simmered beneath the surface. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Marcus, a senator with national reach, and a community that needed to be woken up. Tomorrow would be the first step towards something bigger. The next morning, Joseph awoke to a flood of messages on his phone. Word had spread quickly about what had happened to him, and people were already talking. But it wasn't just gossip. There were messages of support, anger, and disgust at Wilson's actions. As Joseph scrolled through the texts and emails, he realized that what had happened wasn't just an isolated event. It had struck a chord with the community, and not just the black residents. People were ready to act. By noon, a small but growing crowd had gathered outside Wilson's diner. People carried signs that read "Justice for Joseph" and "No room for hate here." The voices of the crowd rose, chanting, as they demanded an apology and a change in the way things were run in Cedar Grove. Wilson, peering out from behind the blinds, was furious. He had never expected this. In his mind, he had done what was right, upholding the values his father had instilled in him. But seeing the anger outside, hearing the chants that grew louder with each passing minute, he began to feel a knot of fear form in his stomach. Across town, Joseph stood on his front porch, watching the news reports come in. He wasn't the type of man to seek attention, and seeing his name plastered across the television screen made him uneasy. He knew this was bigger than him now. Marcus had been right. This was about exposing the prejudice that still lingered beneath the surface of their town. Just as Joseph was about to turn off the TV, his phone rang again. This time, it was Marcus. "Dad, the protests are getting bigger. It's time to make a statement." Joseph paused for a moment, then nodded to himself. "All right, son, I'm ready." When Marcus Carter arrived in Cedar Grove later that afternoon, the protest had swelled to more than 100 people. Word had spread far beyond the town limits, and now reporters from nearby cities were showing up, microphones in hand, ready to broadcast the story of a small-town diner embroiled in a national conversation about racism and justice. Dressed in his sharp suit, Marcus cut an imposing figure as he walked through the crowd, shaking hands with people, listening to their concerns. His eyes were sharp and determined, his jaw set in resolve. He wasn't just here as Joseph Carter's son. He was here as a representative of every person who had been wronged and silenced. He made his way to the front of the diner, where Wilson stood outside the door, arms crossed, his face red with anger and fear. Wilson had never imagined that a single refusal of service could snowball into this. A full-scale protest, national attention, and now a powerful senator standing at his doorstep. "Are you Wilson?" Marcus asked calmly, his voice carrying over the crowd. Wilson's jaw tightened. "Yeah, I am. What's it to you?" Marcus stepped closer, his presence commanding the attention of everyone around. "I'm Marcus Carter, and I'm here to talk about what you did to my father." Wilson sneered, but it was weaker now, his confidence shaken by the weight of Marcus's words. "I don't have to explain myself to you or anyone else. This is my diner, and I have the right to refuse service to whoever I want." Marcus didn't flinch. He was calm, controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge to his tone. "Your right to refuse service doesn't include the right to discriminate. What you did wasn't just wrong, it was illegal, and I intend to make sure you understand that." The crowd fell silent. All eyes were on the two men, one filled with righteous determination, the other with fading bravado. Wilson opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, Marcus continued. "This isn't just about my father. This is about every person you've made feel unwelcome here. You've built a legacy of exclusion, and that ends today." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers as Marcus stepped back, his message delivered. But for Wilson, the reality of what was coming began to sink in. He had thought himself untouchable, safe behind his diner's doors, but now he realized just how wrong he had been. The weight of the law, the power of public opinion, and the force of change were about to descend on him, and there was no escape. The following days saw Cedar Grove split in two. On one side, those who supported Marcus and Joseph rallied around the veterans' table, the vision that Marcus had begun to build. A community diner where everyone, regardless of race or background, would be welcome. On the other side, there were those who, like Wilson, clung to the old ways of thinking. They resented the attention, the protests, and the idea that they needed to change. As Marcus continued his campaign to turn the diner into a symbol of unity, Wilson retreated further into his bitterness. He began to lose more than just customers. He lost friends, business partners, and the respect he once commanded in the town. The weight of his decision to deny Joseph service hung over him like a dark cloud. Meanwhile, Joseph watched the unfolding drama with a sense of disbelief. He had never expected his quiet life in Cedar Grove to become the center of a national conversation. But with each passing day, as he saw the community coming together, he began to feel a sense of pride, not just in Marcus, but in the change that was happening. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. In the days following the protest, Marcus worked tirelessly to put his plan in motion. He had no intention of letting the situation devolve into a legal battle or endless protests. Instead, Marcus focused on turning the negativity surrounding Wilson's actions into something positive and lasting, a symbol of what could be achieved when a community came together. He called in favors, using his connections to reach out to local leaders, veterans organizations, and civil rights advocates. Slowly, but surely, Marcus began to lay the groundwork for something bigger than just a diner. He envisioned the veterans' table as a place where not only veterans could gather and find support, but also a space where the town's racial and social divisions could be healed over shared meals and stories. Wilson, meanwhile, was spiraling. His business was losing money rapidly, with only a few loyal customers remaining. His pride and stubbornness kept him from admitting to himself that he had made a grave mistake. But as each day passed, the weight of his actions bore down on him more heavily. He had alienated not only his customers, but his friends, and even his family had begun to distance themselves. Finally, Marcus approached Wilson with a proposal. He offered to buy the diner, but not out of spite or revenge. He made it clear that he wanted to transform it into something positive, something that would benefit the entire community, including Wilson. In the offer, Marcus promised that Wilson could stay involved as a chef, allowing him a chance at redemption. At first, Wilson scoffed at the idea, his pride refusing to let him concede. But as the days turned to weeks and his diner grew emptier, the desperation began to creep in. Late one night, after closing up his nearly deserted diner, Wilson sat alone at a booth. The weight of his father's legacy seemed to press down on him harder than ever. The thought of letting go of the diner, something that had been in his family for generations, was unbearable. But the reality of his situation was just as grim. He couldn't hold on much longer, not without help. That night, As he stared at Marcus's offer sitting on the table, he finally realized that this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about survival, not just for his business, but for himself. Wilson picked up the phone and made the call that would change everything. The grand reopening of the Veterans Table was a momentous event for Cedar Grove. Marcus had spared no effort in transforming the once dingy diner into a bright, welcoming space that reflected the values he wanted to promote. The walls were lined with photographs of veterans, black, white, and Latino, standing side by side, smiling, their bonds forged through shared service. The diner's atmosphere had changed entirely. Where once there had been a sense of division, there was now an unmistakable air of hope and unity. The town's residents, many of whom had been divided along racial and social lines, were now sitting together at tables, sharing meals, and having conversations that had been avoided for far too long. Marcus, standing near the entrance with his father, couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he watched the people of Cedar Grove come together. It wasn't just about food anymore, it was about healing. And there, behind the counter, was Wilson. Marcus had kept his word and allowed Wilson to stay on as head chef, giving him a chance to rebuild the relationships he had shattered. At first, Wilson had been nervous about his return to the diner. He had expected glares, cold shoulders, maybe even protests. But what he found was something different. People were watching him with curiosity, but also with a sense of cautious forgiveness. He had a long road ahead of him to earn back the trust of the town, but at least now, he had the opportunity to try. As he prepared dishes and greeted customers, Wilson found himself in unfamiliar territory. For the first time in his life, he was being held accountable not just for his actions, but for the legacy he had inherited from his father, a legacy he was finally beginning to question. As weeks passed, the Veterans Table became more than just a diner. It became a beacon of hope, not only for Cedar Grove, but for neighboring towns as well. People began traveling for miles around to visit the diner, drawn by the story of its transformation. Local news outlets covered the diner's journey, highlighting it as a symbol of reconciliation and the power of community. But the ripple effect didn't stop there. Marcus's efforts had sparked conversations across the state. Towns that had long ignored the underlying tensions within their communities were now looking at the Veterans Table as an example of what could be achieved when people came together with open hearts and minds. Veterans from all walks of life began to gather at the diner regularly, not just to eat, but to share their experiences. It became a safe space where people could come to tell their stories, connect with others, and find the support they needed. The diner started hosting weekly gatherings for veterans, where they could come together to discuss issues they were facing and where members of the community could listen, learn, and offer their support. At one of these gatherings, Joseph found himself sitting next to a young man who had just returned from Afghanistan. The young veteran was struggling to adjust to life back home, feeling isolated and misunderstood. As the young man began to speak, Joseph listened quietly, nodding in understanding. After the veteran finished, Joseph leaned over and said, "I know what it feels like to come back to a place that doesn't feel like home anymore. But you're not alone. Not here." It was moments like these that made the Veterans Table so much more than just a place to eat. It was becoming a community hub, a place where people of all backgrounds could come together to heal, not just from the wounds of war, but from the divisions that had plagued their town for generations. One evening, several months after the reopening, Wilson found himself standing in front of the large mural that now adorned the back wall of the diner. The mural depicted a group of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces etched with determination and camaraderie. At the center of the mural were two figures, a young black soldier and a young white soldier, their arms around each other's shoulders. To anyone who knew the story, the resemblance to a young Joseph Carter and Wilson's father was unmistakable. Wilson stared at the mural for a long time, his emotions swirling. He thought of his father, a man who had raised him with certain beliefs that had shaped the way Wilson had run his life in his diner. But now, for the first time, Wilson was beginning to see his father's legacy for what it truly was, a chain of bitterness and prejudice that had been passed down from generation to generation. With a deep breath, Wilson stepped back, allowing the weight of his realization to settle. He knew now that he had a chance to break that chain, to create a new legacy, not just for himself, but for the town and for the future. And it had all started with a simple act of kindness, Marcus offering him a second chance. That night, as the last customers left and the lights dimmed, Wilson sat at a booth in the quiet diner. He no longer felt the crushing weight of shame or fear. Instead, he felt something new, hope. As the veterans' table continued to thrive, Marcus and Joseph found themselves fielding calls from people all over the country. The story of the diner's transformation had resonated with so many, and now communities everywhere wanted to know how they could replicate what had happened in Cedar Grove. Marcus, ever the strategist, began organizing town halls and speaking engagements, where he shared the story of how a small-town diner had become a symbol of unity and healing. Each event was packed with people eager to learn how they could foster the same sense of community in their own towns. But Marcus and Joseph didn't stop there. They knew that the fight for equality and justice was far from over. They began working with civil rights organizations, veterans groups, and community leaders to create a nationwide initiative focused on healing the deep divisions that still plague the country. It was the beginning of a movement, one that had started with a single act of injustice and had grown into something far more powerful. And at the center of it all was the Veterans Table, a diner that had once been a symbol of exclusion and prejudice, but had become a beacon of hope and reconciliation. The transformation of Cedar Grove didn't happen overnight, but over time, the town began to change in ways that no one could have anticipated. The walls that had once divided the community began to crumble, replaced by a newfound sense of understanding and solidarity. People who had never spoken to each other before were now sitting together at tables, sharing meals and stories. The conversations that had once been avoided were now being had, and the town was healing one step at a time. Joseph, sitting at his usual spot in the diner, watched all of this with quiet pride. He had never sought the spotlight, never wanted to be the center of attention, but seeing what the Veterans Table had become filled him with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. Marcus, standing next to him, smiled as he looked around at the bustling diner. "We did it, Dad," he said softly. Joseph nodded, his heart full. "We did, but the work isn't over." Marcus laughed, knowing his father was right. The work of healing a community was never truly done, but for now they could rest in the knowledge that they had made a difference. And so, as the sun set over Cedar Grove, the Veterans Table remained open, its doors welcoming anyone who wanted to come in, not just for a meal, but for a chance to be part of something bigger, something that would continue to grow and inspire for years to come. In the end, the Veterans Table was not just a story about a diner. It was a story about forgiveness, second chances, and the power of community to overcome the darkest parts of our history. It showed that even in the face of deep-seated prejudice, change is possible, and that sometimes all it takes is a simple act of kindness to spark a movement.